Welcome back, everyone. So this part of the presentation is titled From Flexible Delivery to Blended Learning. There has always in Australia and worldwide really been some sort of technical vocational education system which has been aimed at post-compulsory and largely vocational or technical education. So the idea of technical vocational education is clearly not new. It was in Australia from the time of the landing of the first fleet. And it's certainly true that in the vocational sector, ideas such as part-time learning, often what people called night school or block release, were not uncommon. This was a way of making education or training available to people who were working and had other commitments. So part-time and block release were part of the normal day-to-day activities of lots of the adult post-compulsory technical colleges, and this was particularly common in the post-Second World War period. Also, correspondence or off-campus education was a characteristic of this sector. But what needs to be said about the correspondence or off-campus sectors is they weren't integrated into mainstream institutional work. They sat outside of the mainstream institutions and operated almost independently. In the early 1980s, we saw the emergence of what was then called self-paced learning, and Richmond Tate in the automotive area was one of the first movers in this area. And what that meant was that students were not limited in terms of having to stick to a particular pace. The self-paced learning approach was supported with pre-prepared learning and assessment materials. They used computer assessment, which was automatically recorded, and there were videos, and apprentices were able to finish their apprenticeship in a shorter time than the 4 years that they would normally spend, but at that stage they wouldn't be awarded the apprenticeship until they'd spent a minimum of 4 years in the industry. In Western Australia, they used a term called flexi-mode to characterise what was a combination of on and off-campus studies. So again, these were flexibilities that existed well before the mid-1980s. But there were some significant changes in the mid-1980s, and these were largely associated with economic crisis at the time. Inflation was at very, very high levels. Unemployment was at record levels. Housing interest rates were at record level. So what we saw in the mid to late 1980s was a program of industrial and workplace reform, and with that, to support that, was what was called the National Training Reform Agenda. At about the same time, we saw the emergence of what was called computer-managed learning. This was not so much learning as assessment, that was using standalone or network computers to test, often in the area of mathematics and the other science areas where outcomes were really quite objective. Now, it was really in the early 1990s that the idea of flexible delivery started to bed down, when we started to get a national training system, or a nationally cooperative training system with development of a national training authority. In 1992, what we see is a definition of flexible delivery as an approach to vocational education and training which allows for the adoption of a range of learning strategies and a variety of learning environments to cater for differences in learning styles, learning interests and needs, and variations in learning opportunities, and includes the use of learning technologies where appropriate. So what we see here is a real emphasis on the notion of learning, but learning that is considered and considerate of the learner. We also see an acknowledgement that learning technologies, and remember we're not talking about the internet at this stage, were appropriate and should be used where they were appropriate. The elements of this flexible delivery were really revolved around the idea of competency-based education, which was a centrepiece to the national training system. And what flexibility there was not over content, but rather over learner choice over when, where and how the learning occurred. So what the system was really looking for was flexibilities or choices for learners in terms of when they learned, what times of the day, where they learned. So hopefully it was available not only at multiple times or at discretionary times, but various locations, and a range of means in which the learning would occur. So that might in fact include full-time students, or it might be part-time students, or block release, or off-campus, or online, or whatever. And there was a lot of money spent by the Commonwealth Government on pre-prepared learning and assessment materials. And these, of course, were consistent with the competency statements in what we now know as training packages. By 1996, we start to see a change in the definition of flexible delivery. Here, flexible delivery is seen as an approach rather than a system or techniques. This statement is important because the earlier iteration of flexible delivery really didn't give anyone any clear idea of how it was different to what many people were already doing. It's based on the skill needs and delivery requirements of clients. So here we see a change in the language from learners to clients. And clients, for this purposes, included industry, enterprises, and the learners, not the interests of the trainees and the providers. It gives clients as much control as possible over what and when and where and how they learn. And this, of course, was in the context of training packages. It commonly uses delivery methods of distance education. So this was an acknowledgement that the ideas were not necessarily new and they could be borrowed from elsewhere, and the facilities of technology. So we see a reassertion of technology. It changes the role of the trainer, notice trainer not teacher, from a source of knowledge to a manager of learning or facilitator. At about the same time, we started to see the emergence of the language of online learning, with the statement that the VET sector will establish a clear presence in the new online delivery environment, leading to the development of new world-class training programs and learning experiences available online. And part of this involved the development of what were known as ANTA toolboxes. And of course, you look at the date there, it's 1998, so the internet has been available to the public for about 3 years. By 2000, we start to see a change, and the language of online learning didn't really last very long as a dominant language. It was replaced by the idea of e-learning. And by 2002, the system had tried to define more clearly what was meant by flexible learning, online learning and e-learning. You'll also notice that by this time the idea of flexible delivery had been changed to the idea of flexible learning. And although this re-establishes learning as a central part of the VET mission, it really didn't result in any meaningful change in the way in which the VET sector operated. We also see an emergence of the idea of blended learning or blended modes. So flexible delivery moved to flexible learning, and the ANTA document from 2001 says that by 2004 Australia will be recognised as a global leader in applying new technologies to vocational education training products and services. Reassertion of technology again. What we see in these three definitions is the notion that flexible learning, whilst it's learner-centred and client-focused, so we see a re-emphasis a little bit on learning, but maintaining the client focus. And it's seen as an umbrella term that incorporates online learning and e-learning. So online learning fits into the wider flexible learning strategy. Online learning or web-based learning. So this was learning that was essentially networked through the internet, intranets and extranets, is increasingly understood to be a subset of e-learning. That included technology-supported learning. So what the system was concerned about at that point was that online learning was a little bit too restrictive in that it involved networks, and that really e-learning was seen as a sort of better terminology because it includes the use of standalone computers, DVDs, and the emergence of things like MP3 players or iPods and iPads and so on and so forth in recent times. So e-learning is a wide set of applications and processes which use all available electronic media. So here we're talking about digital media, not analogue media. To deliver vocational education and training, it includes computer-based learning, web-based learning, virtual classrooms, digital collaboration and uses. And that's really the point at which we still are in terms of definitions. Of course, what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is in the Commonwealth policy is the development of the National Broadband Network, and that is playing a key role in current strategic plans for flexible learning or flexible delivery in the vocational sector. How that's going to